The moment a woman realizes you will tolerate disrespect just to keep her in your life, the entire dynamic changes. Because now she knows something dangerous about you. She knows you're afraid to lose her, and once that fear becomes visible, boundaries start collapsing one by one. She becomes colder, more careless, more comfortable crossing lines she never would have crossed with a man who truly understood his own value. Not because women naturally enjoy disrespecting men, but because people instinctively test what they believe they can get away with. That's why the most powerful response to disrespect is rarely emotional. It's silent, it's controlled, it's final. See, most men react the same way when a woman disrespects them. They argue, explain, demand accountability. They try to make her understand how much she hurt them, hoping that if they say the right words, she'll suddenly change. But the problem is this. The moment you start fighting for basic respect, you've already lowered your position in the connection, because respect that has to be negotiated is no longer respect. And a man who truly values himself understands something most men never learn until it's too late. You do not beg for a place in someone's life after they've shown you they can casually disregard your presence. You remove yourself completely, quietly, without warning, without speeches, without emotional theatrics, and that silence hits harder than any argument ever could. Because now she's left alone with something she never expected to experience. Your absence. Real absence. Not temporary distance. Not another emotional reaction that eventually fades. But a complete shift in access to you. Your energy disappears. Your attention disappears. Your consistency disappears. And suddenly the man she assumed would always remain emotionally available is simply gone. That's when confusion starts settling into her mind. Because up until this point, she believed she understood the dynamic completely. She believed no matter how she acted, no matter how inconsistent or disrespectful she became, you would still remain emotionally tied to her. Most men do. Most men stay available long after they should have walked away. That's why genuine detachment feels so shocking when it finally happens, especially from a man she thought was emotionally dependent on her presence. Now she starts replaying conversations in her head, trying to pinpoint the exact moment something changed, trying to understand why you stopped reacting the way you used to, and the more silence she encounters, the more emotionally heavy that silence becomes. Because silence forces reflection in ways arguments never do. This is where most men ruin everything. They announce their departure dramatically. They send long emotional paragraphs explaining why they're leaving. They threaten to disappear, promise they're done. And all of it communicates the same thing underneath. I still need you to emotionally react to me. But a man who genuinely understands his worth doesn't perform his exit. He simply leaves, calmly. And that calmness unsettles her far more deeply than anger ever could, because anger still signals attachment. True detachment does not. Now here's where this becomes powerful psychologically. When access to you disappears suddenly, her mind experiences a break in emotional certainty. The messages stop. The reactions stop. The predictable attention she relied on is no longer there to reassure her position in your life. And human psychology naturally fixates on what suddenly becomes unavailable, especially when that availability once felt guaranteed. That's why cutting off access without warning creates such a strong emotional impact. Not because you're punishing her, but because your absence forces her to emotionally experience the consequences of losing access to you. And if you do this correctly, you do it fully. No secretly checking her stories, no liking posts from a distance, no leaving tiny emotional breadcrumbs behind, just so she remembers you exist. Because every small form of contact weakens the message your silence is communicating. And the message is simple. You no longer have access to the version of me you took for granted. That requires discipline, real discipline. Because there will be moments where your ego wants confirmation that she noticed. Moments where you'll feel tempted to check if she reached out or reacted. But the man who grows through this process redirects that energy immediately. Into training, into business, into purpose, into building a life so focused and structured that her absence no longer creates emotional chaos inside him. Because if you remove her from your phone but keep replaying her in your mind all day, you haven't truly detached. You've only changed locations for the obsession. Real detachment happens when your attention returns fully to yourself, and once that shift happens, something unexpected starts occurring. You stop seeing the situation as a loss. You start seeing it as the moment you finally remembered your standards. And from that point forward, the way people treat you begins changing completely. And if you really want this shift to become permanent, not just something you understand intellectually, but something that becomes part of your identity, then you need structure behind the mindset. Because discipline fades when emotions take over. That's why resources like the Stoic relationship blueprint exist, not as motivation, not as another temporary boost, but as a framework you can return to every time old patterns try to pull you backward. Every time loneliness tempts you to lower your standards. Every time someone tests boundaries you worked hard to build. Every time your emotions start negotiating against your own self-respect. The difference between men who repeat the same cycles and men who completely transform their lives usually comes down to one thing: consistency. And consistency becomes much easier when you have principles you can return to instead of reacting emotionally in the moment. Because the truth is, once a man learns how to center himself properly, betrayal stops destroying him, disrespect stops shaking him, rejection stops defining him. And that leads directly into the second silent move: level up in silence. Because after walking away, the worst thing you can do is stay emotionally frozen while secretly obsessing over what happened. Most men disappear physically, but mentally, they remain trapped in the same place for months. Watching her stories, checking her activity, replaying conversations at night like somehow the past will suddenly rewrite itself. And while they're stuck emotionally circling the wound, their entire life stalls. But the man who truly changes uses pain differently. He converts it into momentum, into discipline, into fuel. He understands that the strongest response to disrespect is not revenge, it's elevation. And not loud elevation either, quiet elevation. Because there's something incredibly powerful about building yourself without announcing it to the world. No constant posting, no fake grind mode performance, no desperate attempts to show her what she lost. That energy always exposes hidden attachment. Real transformation is quieter than that. It happens early in the morning when nobody is watching. It happens in empty gyms, in business meetings, in books most people never open, in habits repeated long after motivation disappears. And the reason silence becomes so effective during this process is because silence creates uncertainty. She no longer has access to your inner world. She doesn't know whether you're struggling or thriving, whether you're broken or rebuilding. And the human mind naturally fills empty spaces with imagination. That's where the shift begins, because while she expected you to remain emotionally damaged by her absence, your silence prevents her from measuring your progress. Then months pass, and eventually she hears your name again, maybe through mutual friends, maybe through social media, maybe through an unexpected encounter, and suddenly the version of you she remembers no longer exists. Your body changed, your energy changed, your focus changed. There's a calmness in you now that wasn't there before. Not forced confidence, not performative arrogance. Real grounded composure, the kind built through suffering, discipline, and self-control. That's when regret becomes heavier, not because you insulted her, not because you tried to make her jealous, but because she realizes she completely underestimated the man she once had access to. And here's what most people never understand about this stage. The goal is not to make her come back. The goal is to become someone who would never again tolerate what once broke him. That requires a complete internal rebuild. New standards, new habits, new routines. You wake earlier, think clearer, move differently. You stop feeding distractions that once kept you weak. And over time, your entire life begins reflecting a standard that emotionally unavailable people can no longer comfortably enter. That's why genuine self-improvement changes relationship dynamics so dramatically. Because people can feel when a man has stopped needing external validation to function. And once that happens, his presence changes, his silence changes, even his absence changes. Now here's the irony. The men who truly evolve in silence usually stop caring whether the woman notices at all, because eventually the growth becomes personal, not emotional revenge, not hidden bitterness, just self-respect expressed through action. And strangely enough, that's often the exact moment she finally starts paying attention again, because people are deeply unsettled by someone they can no longer emotionally influence, especially someone they once believed would always remain attached to them. And when she realizes her disrespect didn't destroy you, it refined you, the entire power dynamic flips permanently, which brings us to the third move. And honestly, this is where most men unknowingly give all their power away. They keep explaining themselves, explaining their boundaries, explaining why they left, explaining why they changed, not realizing that every unnecessary explanation places their self-worth into someone else's hands for approval. And the moment you start asking someone to validate your standards, you stop standing on them completely, because people who already disrespected you rarely use explanations to understand you better. They use them to regain emotional control, to minimize what happened, to twist accountability into confusion, to make you question instincts you already knew were right the first time. And a man who truly understands his value eventually reaches a dangerous level of clarity. He realizes that not every boundary requires a speech, because the moment you stop over-explaining yourself, something unexpected happens. You start noticing how many conversations were never about understanding you in the first place. They were about controlling your response. And when a woman feels you slipping out of her emotional reach, she will often try to reopen the connection through conversation, not always directly. Sometimes it sounds soft, curious, almost innocent. I just want to understand what happened. But underneath that question is usually something much deeper. She's trying to regain access to your emotional energy, trying to pull you back into a dynamic where your attention still revolves around her reactions. And this is exactly where most men lose all the progress they made, because they mistake explaining for closure. So they write long messages, detailed explanations, paragraphs filled with logic, emotion, disappointment, thinking that if they finally communicate clearly enough, she'll suddenly understand their value. But value that requires constant explanation rarely feels valuable. And more importantly, she doesn't need another explanation. She already experienced your standards through your actions. That's what walking away was. That's what silence was. That's what your absence communicated. Words become unnecessary when behavior already delivered the message. The danger of over-explaining is not just that it keeps the conversation alive. It keeps her emotionally centered in your mind. Now her opinion becomes something you subconsciously manage. Her understanding becomes more important than your direction. And the longer a man lives like that, the weaker his internal authority becomes. That's why a grounded man responds differently when questioned. When she asks why you disappeared, why you stopped responding, why you seem different, he doesn't emotionally unload everything he's been carrying. He stays composed, simple, direct. I've been focused on myself lately. And then he lets silence finish the sentence. Because men with real direction understand something powerful. Not everyone deserves full access to your inner world, especially people who already mishandled your presence once before. Now here's the deeper lesson hidden underneath all of this. Learning not to over-explain isn't only about women. It changes every part of your life. When friends mock your discipline, when family questions your vision, when co-workers wonder why you no longer participate in distractions that used to drain you, the instinct will always be to justify yourself so people feel comfortable with your transformation. But growth often requires becoming comfortable being misunderstood, because people who genuinely respect you rarely demand endless explanations for your boundaries. And people committed to misunderstanding you will twist even your clearest explanation into something else anyway. That's why certainty becomes magnetic, especially in relationships. Women are naturally drawn toward men who move decisively, men who trust their judgment, men who don't emotionally collapse every time someone disagrees with them. And the moment you stop seeking approval for every decision, your entire energy changes. There's less hesitation in you, less emotional noise, less need to convince. You simply move, quietly, confidently, and ironically, that calm certainty often earns more respect from the same people who once dismissed you, because now they realize pressure no longer moves you the way it used to. For the woman who disrespected you, your silence becomes deeply unsettling, not because you're punishing her, but because your lack of explanation communicates something she didn't expect. You're no longer emotionally trapped inside the need to be understood by her. You've already accepted the separation internally, and once someone feels that emotional shift from you, they begin realizing they no longer occupy the same psychological space in your life. That realization carries weight, because now she understands something uncomfortable. You didn't leave impulsively, you left peacefully, and peaceful detachment is much harder to reverse than emotional anger. That's when you begin reclaiming energy you wasted for years trying to make the wrong people understand your intentions. You stop defending your standards, you start living them, and eventually you realize that a man with purpose doesn't spend his life convincing people of his value. He builds a life that reflects it naturally. Which leads directly into the fourth move. Redirect your energy into a stronger environment, because walking away from disrespect is only the beginning. What happens after the separation determines whether you actually evolve or simply repeat the cycle with someone else later. Too many men think removing one toxic person automatically transforms their life. It doesn't. If your routines remain weak, if your environment remains stagnant, if the people around you still normalize mediocrity, then eventually loneliness will pull you backward toward what feels familiar. Not because it was healthy, because it was comfortable. And comfort has a dangerous way of disguising itself as emotional attachment. That's why your environment matters so much after you walk away, because the people surrounding you either reinforce your discipline or quietly destroy it. A stronger circle changes your standards without you even noticing. Now conversations revolve around progress, health, business, purpose, execution, accountability. You enter rooms where excuses sound embarrassing, rooms where growth becomes the normal expectation. And slowly, something inside you begins changing. Your focus shifts. You stop obsessing over whether she misses you, because your mind is occupied building things that matter more than validation ever did. Now your energy is moving toward expansion instead of emotional survival. And once a man experiences that shift fully, he can never comfortably return to the version of himself that once tolerated less. Because once your environment changes, your identity starts changing with it. And that's when the people from your past begin feeling something they can't quite explain. They notice your energy is no longer available in the same places. You're no longer participating in the same conversations, no longer reacting to the same drama, no longer emotionally attached to the same patterns that once kept you trapped. And for the woman who once believed she had permanent access to you, that shift becomes deeply unsettling, because now she's forced to watch from a distance as you evolve into a life she can no longer enter. Not because you shut the door dramatically, but because you outgrew the room completely. That's what creates lasting regret. Not simply leaving, thriving after you leave, especially when your growth places you in circles where your value is recognized naturally instead of constantly questioned. When people around you respect discipline, respect ambition, respect emotional control, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. And over time, you stop caring whether she notices any of it. Because the life you're building becomes bigger than the wound that started it. That's when the final shift happens internally. You stop needing revenge. You stop replaying the disrespect. You stop fantasizing about proving something. And ironically, that emotional freedom is what makes your transformation undeniable, which leads to the fifth silent move. Show no emotional recoil, because when someone hurts you, especially someone you once cared about deeply, the instinct is to react, to let the anger show, to make them feel the weight of what they did. Part of you wants them to see the damage, wants them to understand how badly they affected you. But emotional reactions give people information. They reveal where you're vulnerable. And if someone can still pull intense reactions out of you whenever they choose, then emotionally, they still hold influence over you. That's why composure becomes power, not fake indifference, not coldness, real internal steadiness, the kind that refuses to hand emotional control over to another person. And this is difficult because silence often feels unnatural at first, especially when you know you could destroy someone with words, especially when you want justice. But Stoic strength is not about winning emotional battles. It's about refusing to become emotionally chaotic just because someone else is. That's what separates controlled men from reactive men. One seeks emotional release, the other protects his peace. And when you become truly steady, something interesting happens. People who rely on drama lose their power around you because they can no longer predict your reactions. They can no longer provoke you into lowering yourself. No raised voice, no desperate paragraphs, no emotional collapse, just calm distance. Calm focus, calm certainty. That silence becomes unforgettable, because now she's left alone with the realization that she can no longer affect you the way she once could. And that realization stays with people much longer than arguments ever do, especially women who once believed your emotional attachment guaranteed permanent access to you. Now there's nothing left for her to manipulate, nothing left for her to decode, nothing left to fight against. Only absence, only distance. Only the uncomfortable awareness that the man she thought would always remain emotionally available has completely detached himself from her world. And the deeper truth is this: your ability to remain composed after disrespect changes far more than relationships. It changes negotiations, friendships, business, family dynamics. Because once people realize they can't emotionally destabilize you, they stop attempting to control you through pressure. That's real power, quiet power. The kind that doesn't need validation because it already knows itself. And if you want to build that level of control, it starts with slowing yourself down. Pause before reacting. Breathe before responding. Separate temporary emotion from permanent decisions. Train yourself to value peace more than emotional victory. Because every moment you refuse to react impulsively, you strengthen something inside yourself most people never develop. Emotional discipline. And over time, people begin sensing it immediately. They realize getting under your skin no longer works, which means your presence alone starts commanding a different level of respect. Now understand this clearly. Life keeps repeating the same lessons until you finally enforce a standard that cannot be negotiated, not announced, enforced. The moment you stop tolerating disrespect simply because you fear losing someone, everything changes. And if you want deeper guidance on building that mindset permanently, the Stoic relationship blueprint for men is linked below. It's designed to help you turn these principles into habits you actually live by, especially during moments when emotions try to pull you backward. Because knowledge alone doesn't transform a man, practice does. So if this message spoke to something you've been feeling quietly for a long time, leave a comment saying, "I'm untouchable." Subscribe to Modern Stoic Mind for more lessons like this. And remember, the most powerful revenge is becoming so grounded in your own purpose that the people who once underestimated you can no longer recognize the man you became.